Next up, we have a panel coordinated by our very own Nina Huntman, who's the Senior Director of Academics and Research at edX, and I'll have her and the panel introduce themselves next. Thanks.
Make sure you turn your mics on. Hi, everyone. I'm Nina Huntman, as Marco said, Director of Academics and Research at edX, and I'm joined by a fantastic panel of brilliant and brave colleagues from some of the universities that are on edX.org. So I'm going to have them introduce themselves and a little bit about what they're doing at their institutions that is related to this conference. And then if each one of you could also describe briefly to the group a challenge that you're facing in this space of online learning at scale. So Paul, why don't you start?
Hi everyone, my name is Paul Walsh. I'm the Program Director for USMX, that's the University System of Maryland, and that's probably the challenge, is the systemness. We are 12 institutions, not one, so imagine trying to herd cats with a strategic plan for online learning that incorporates small schools, large schools, lovely small school by the beach, another one up by the mountains. We have HBCUs and Research One institutions. We have institutions that don't have very much of any online presence. And then we've got another like University of Maryland University College with 90,000 online students. So where each of them are heading and how we can support them both with some online strategic planning and with where we do work with edX and where Open edX might fit in with each of them is a guessing game. So that's one of my big challenges.
Hi, I'm Karen Flammer. I direct digital learning here at UC San Diego. Our campus currently supports about 90 MOOCs across Coursera and edX. On the edX platform, we have a couple MicroMasters, we have a professional certificate, and then we have a number of single courses. Our campus just stood up Open edX, so I'm looking forward to developing many more certificate programs and courses on that. The campus does not have, it only has a handful of credit-bearing online courses, and we currently don't have any online degrees. However, what's critical, I think, to some of this discussion is we have a very successful MicroMasters in data science, a credential program. That was, all of this for us was really an experiment in the MOOC space. But the successful experience with the MicroMaster in data science has led us to now partner with edX, pending lots of internal approvals on campus and University of California and whatnot, to launch a fully online degree in data science. And again, this will be our campus, the first online degree for our campus. So it's kind of an example of how experimentation has really stimulated innovation on our campus. We have a lot of challenges. I think a lot of challenges have been how to resource and support these credentialing programs, MOOC programs and courses, because they're not credit-bearing. And so finding the equivalent of TA support, getting faculty to continuously engage when they're not getting teaching credit. We've developed some models, but that's been a challenge for us.
Hi, my name is Jim Hall. I'm the Dean of University Studies at Rochester Institute of Technology. We're a comprehensive polytechnic institute in Western New York, about 20,000 students. Experienced some pretty dramatic cultural change, I'd say, over the past 25 years. We used to be pretty intimately tied to local workforce development needs, particularly in computer science and in imaging, connected to the history of Rochester around Kodak and Xerox in particular. We've been with edX for 3 years now. We don't have any instance of Open edX. We run 2 MicroMasters programs in cybersecurity and project management. We have a professional certificate in soft skills. And we have some standalone X-Series courses in video game design and history. I'd capture our challenges being faculty knowledge and faculty capacity. We have a tendency to engage faculty when we need a major policy change, when we want them to approve something new programmatic to come along. But then we tend to leave them alone and not engage them, and they forget what we're up to, and they become see us as untrustworthy very quickly. They have a legitimate interest in their own, in the future of their own labor, and so we need to do a better job of explaining to them in an ongoing way what it is that we're trying to do.
Great, thanks. So each of you in your introduction touched upon a lot of the points I'd like to dive into deeper. And as well, I'm hoping that the audience will think about questions that they have. We may not save them to the end. We may just pull from the audience if there's something that we think you have some reflection about, as well as if folks here on the stage would like to hear perhaps what you think about some of the things that come up. So I'd like to start with sustainable practice. Each of your organizations have been involved in the MOOC space for a while now, and I'm curious to know how you've had to change or add the capacity and the capabilities of your teams, whether that's the kinds of job descriptions you're writing today that you weren't writing 5 years ago, the size of the teams, and perhaps how you've managed, maybe with struggles, sure, to get the resources for those teams. Paul, I know there's been quite a bit of change in the UCM system, so perhaps you could address this first.
So I have a few instructional designers who we plug into different course teams throughout the state. So those designers have expertise, and edX have expertise, of course, in instructional design, and then plug into a local course team that maybe hasn't used edX much, or maybe not at all, hasn't done anything at scale, and already has their other full-time job. So you can imagine, that's a really difficult relationship to manage. What I see evolving over time is that the role of the instructional designer, and I know there are a lot of you here, the role of the developer is changing a good bit. You're expected to be now a data scientist. You're expected to be a project manager all at the same time, because now you're not just working one-on-one. Back in the day when I came up, as a faculty member, as an instructional designer, you were knee-to-knee with the faculty member, creating a course together. Now you're on a course team. Now there are deliverables and contingency plans and Gantt charts. And that's a really alien world for a lot of our faculty who bristle when it comes to deadlines and deliverables, because they've got their full-time job still as well. We haven't quite nailed down with 12 institutions how each faculty member is compensated, or do they get a release, do they get money, do they get share revenue for their work on edX, and who ultimately is running the course. Is it the faculty member, is it the designer, is it somebody else, is it a dean? So we're still trying to figure out all of that, and adding edX to the kind of the evolution of instructional design has only made this more interesting and more of a challenge.
Karen, can you answer the question of who's running the course?
So, again, 90 MOOCs, these, micro-credential programs, it's grown organically. I have built a team of undergraduate students that have been really the acting as, I also have instructional designers, but again, for these non-credit bearing programs, this team of undergraduate students, and of course, undergraduates, are only around for 4 years and then they move on. So I continuously am training new ones, but they act as course builders. They now are experts on Coursera, edX, our own LMS system, Canvas. They sometimes act as the product manager for the deadlines. They develop very close relationships with the faculty that are leading these courses. And it's really been a model that has allowed us to scale. But we're at a critical point right now, especially now that we're kind of on the verge of having one of our MicroMasters be credit-bearing for potentially a master's degree. What I've struggled with is, these undergraduates, they're not TAs. They're not the traditional graduate student TAs. They're not compensated as that. They don't always have the content knowledge to be monitoring the courses now that are going to be part of a graduate level program. So we're in a shift now with, again, how we're going to kind of allocate resources a little bit differently once these micro-credentials actually become part of a full degree program. But it's really the model for the undergraduate interns that has allowed us to scale as we've scaled.
So I'd like to ask a few questions about running a non-credit bearing program inside of institutions that are almost wholly focused on credentialing credit bearing programs. So if you could share maybe some success stories. I know each of you have worked really hard to get to move through your institution's processes to get some of these non-credit bearing credentials out the door and to the world. Perhaps you can share a successful path or at least some advice for those who might be doing the same on their campuses. Jim?
Well, frankly, the non-credit space has been easier for us to build quickly and to get out the door. Less faculty anxiety, less institutional anxiety about how we're measuring credit, how we're going to engage our creditors on that front. I think it's been, for our university communications team, a pretty steady flow of the kinds of success stories that Anant was sharing this morning. It's also been about brand extension. It's been about telling the community that we're looking for students that are eventually going to come to us in a more traditional way or come to our regular online space. We're still stuck with some fundamental capacity issues. There are faculty members who would like to build non-credit vehicles, but don't have the time, don't have the workload room to make it happen. So we could be doing more. We could be engaging with Open edX, most certainly more than we do currently. But we've been pretty deliberate, I think, about what we've put out into the world. And some of it is floating something, seeing if it gets traction, and coming back to it and thinking about how we can put it to some other purpose.
Karen, I know you're... Oh, Paul, go ahead. You have a
I was just going to add a quick story. University of Maryland School of Business, the Smith School, faculty meeting as they're really deciding whether or not to pull the trigger on a MicroMasters. A lot of back and forth between faculty members when one faculty member finally says, it's not a question of how can we afford to do this, it's a question of how can we afford not to. And the whole conversation pivoted, and they wrapped it up in a few minutes. Pocket
that question, plant it in the audience, and there you go. Great. Here.
So again, as I mentioned, just partnering with these platform providers and developing these MOOCs and these MOOC programs. There's been, it's been pockets of faculty, mainly I'd say in our computer science and our data science, departments that have had interest. But the idea that grew out of the success of the MicroMasters, and it's not just of the data science MicroMasters, it's not just the success, it's the experience that the faculty have had developing it and seeing the uptake in the students that have taken this and just seeing the feedback that they've gotten. It's the fact that these faculty also travel a lot around the world to conferences and they get stopped in airports, saying, we recognize you, I took that course in probability and statistics, on edX and all that. So certainly the brand recognition, but this is really what has, internally, again, led to the interest in developing potentially our first fully online master's degree, was the experience that the faculty had with not getting any teaching credit, yes, kind of like struggling with resource allocation to support this program, but it was the experience in developing it and delivering it and seeing the benefit that learners were getting out of this program that has really, stimulated further interest in online education and innovating in terms of a degree.
I think we often think about as Anat described in his opening remarks, the learner is very different than the learner of 40 years ago or even 20 years ago. But each one of your campuses have been engaged in that non-traditional learner, that's becoming the traditional learner, for many years. But it seems to me, at least from the outside, that there's a tipping point where now there's an understanding that professional learner is a significant, not just a side project, not just an also and we additive to what but is infiltrating the thinking about the mission of the university. And certainly UMUC, part of the USM system, has had that focused for a while. Could you provide some insight, perhaps, maybe I'm totally off, but is that non-traditional learner now really the center of how some of your programs and your faculty and your administration are thinking about the mission of the institution, transforming it, perhaps? Jim?
Yes. I think we've been trying to prepare the institution for a different set of learner relationships that are more casual, perhaps short-term. This is not an easy transition to pull off, particularly we're a relatively young institution. We're somewhat obsessed with building sustainable relationships with alums that we hope will give back to the institution. So on the one hand, some of the data that we put out there is eye-popping for the campus, for a campus that typically delivers courses that have 15 to 150 learners in a classroom, to be reporting out to faculty and, for that matter, to senior leadership that you're enrolling 40, 50, 60,000 folks in a learning environment is exciting. But we also set ourselves up for some unreasonable expectations, too, when we do that as well. So I think we're really early in the game in terms of telling the story, what it means to have shorter-term relationships with learners who now know the brand in ways in which perhaps they didn't before, and parts of the world that we weren't before. But it's not obvious yet what this new set of relationships has to do with our overall business strategy as to how to become a sustainable institution.
Paul, do you want to respond to that?
Certainly the non-traditional students always been of interest to an institution like UMUC, as you mentioned. But I'll tell a tale out of school a little bit, if we all keep it secret. There was concern with, are we going to be stealing from our own enrollment? UMUC has an international presence, and there was concern that as they rolled out 5 MicroMasters, that they'd be seeing a decline. So after, let's say 6 months or so, as we neared the 100,000 learner mark, I stood up the list of edX learners against their own learners. Anybody that had ever been in the UMUC pipeline for the last, let's say, 10 years. And the edX learners were 98.2% never seen in the UMUC data. Did that quell the question of whether they were stealing from their own enrollment? No. But it was still a telling statistic, and it helped us say that this is a different audience of adult learners, a different audience of non-traditional learners that we should still pursue.
So we touched a little bit about sustainable practice and a bit about how credentials are disrupting some of what you've done traditionally at your universities. I'd like to move to digital learning. So as you know, the audience here at Open edX is filled with educators and technologists. And I think it would be of interest to the group to hear from the three of you as you've launched and scaled your educational offerings. How have you thought about the learning you're building in these spaces? That can be anything from building authentic assessments that are going to be recognized for credit that might be different than your professionally oriented programs, that's not as important. So from a digital learning design perspective, what are some of the things you can offer the audience that you've seen and done? Jim?
I think the disciplinary specialists that have had the greatest hands-on role in building some of these structures have taken real pleasure in meditating on the question of what it means to do learning at this kind of scale. I think the larger challenge remains with our faculty community as a whole, who, whenever we engage our sense of what the opportunities might be in this space, want to draw a distinction between what they call training and what they think of as being education. And oftentimes the conversation I'm locked into with a faculty member is, all of these things produce short-term useful skills in an employment market, but do they really produce wisdom? And aren't we in the wisdom business? And I both want to ask folks to hold off on that question to some degree, but I also want to take it really seriously. I think I think it's key to getting at faculty anxiety around their own labor. It's key to getting at faculty anxiety around what the future of our physical plant is. We certainly have to, we engage at the level of boards of trustees an enthusiasm for these experiments because they see it as a potential panacea to all of our revenue challenges. So this issue of what constitutes authentic assessment in this space is really intriguing to me, and figuring out ways to continually meditate on this distinction that faculty want to draw between learning and education, I think is worthwhile.
Karen, that distinction between wisdom and training, does it need to be a dichotomy? Are there ways in which we're in fact perhaps changing that?
So I think our campus is realizing that a lot of our graduates of our degrees, whether they're in engineering, computer science, and some of the real applied fields, there still is potentially a gap between the knowledge and skills that they need in the workforce. And so I think as much as, for a very long time, our faculty, our campus is going to hold on to the idea of the traditional degree, being the proxy of wisdom and all that. I think there's a recognition now and a kind of a trend towards recognizing that supplementing that degree with micro-credentials and more skill-based training is necessary. And again, whether the two sets of learners are totally separate, whether it's the professional learners that are taking all our credentialing programs, and that's very different than our traditional students. I think now that is the case, but I think that our own students, our own traditional on-ground students, will benefit from the increments of knowledge that we create online for these credentialing programs. So, my big prediction is in 5 years, there is going to be more of a blending. This whole thing now, I call them learning workers, right? Learning workers, knowing that anyone now that goes into a profession is going to have to skill and reskill and upskill in the future. That is just the nature of this ever-changing workforce. And the university's role is to produce people. Not everybody stays in academia, right? There's not enough jobs in academia, even if you get a PhD, is to be producing students that can go out in this ever-changing workforce. And in my mind, these micro-credentials and these programs are really the key for that, to blend that with traditional learning.
So I'd like to open it up to the audience to ask questions. Time flies by really quickly up here, doesn't it? So if those who have the mic runners could help me with that. And as you're thinking about questions, I know in our call before to talk about what we would talk about today, my colleagues up here are interested in the kinds of communities of practice and capabilities that you've been building. So questions, yes, but some brief insights to offer back up on stage is also appreciated. Mic runners? Or are we out of mics? Because we've got them. Oh, you've got, okay, good. Get some folks down the front. Okay, great.
Throw our mics.
Yeah, I like the idea of using undergraduate students. We at IIT Bombay have used them effectively as teaching assistants. They have very high energy levels. However, what I wish to know is from which source of fund do you support them and what kind of internship do you pay them? To sustain the whole effort, we'll need to do that, right? Use of undergraduate students for your activities as course designers.
So which sources of funding for TAs can you use?
So I use the funds that come out of the revenue from our MOOC programs. I reinvest in the undergraduate intern program.
I see.
They're paid probably higher than more per hour than they get in most on-campus jobs, but more than that. It has been transformative for some of these interns. Two of them graduating with undergrad degrees in cognitive science, have now decided that they want to go get masters in instructional design. Wow. Based on their experience in working with faculty and understanding course designs and some learning theories and pedagogy. So it's really been, they're paid internships, but in my mind, they're getting a very unique undergraduate experience to supplement, their other studies.
They could start with an instructional design micromasters.
Yes, exactly. I've told them about that.
I have one more question to the numbers that you mentioned, that there is a concern in existing universities that their enrollment may go down if there are too many online courses. And you proved correctly that more than 95% or whatever were new people. We have a similar problem of scale in India. We have only about 30 million students engaged in higher education, and we wish to get this number to 60 million in next 5 years, which means all these 30 million people will be new people completely. And yet we find that institutions are concerned about giving a degree using MOOCs. They don't mind people doing some credits and so on. So is there any real answer that can be given to all institutions?
So is there fear that they are going to replace the current students with additional, or is it the quality? What can you pinpoint what the concern is about?
No, they are concerned about the current enrollment being taken.
Okay.
In our case, I would say there is a lack of knowledge top to bottom about the work we do in online spaces already. So we deliver probably 30 undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs in fully online spaces. I would say the vast majority of our community is unaware of that. So there's a perception that that we're cannibalizing things. I think there's also just again still some discomfort about what it means to deliver education at the kinds of scale that we're talking about. And again, I'm back at this question of how we perpetually interpret what we do for faculty communities, for administrative communities. It's a challenge.
So I have a brief, but is this on? Over here, James. This is actually meant for James Hall in particular. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm pulling this out of an old brain cell, but Rochester Institute of Technology is somehow connected to a deaf community?
Yes.
Or deaf learning. So I'm particularly interested because technology has had a major impact, particularly texting, on communication among that community. So I'm wondering, have you done any MOOC work with that community? And aside from captioning, are there other things we can do that improve their learning experiences? Because certainly traditional education in a classroom doesn't take them very far.
So RIT is home to the National Technical Institute for the Deaf, which is one of 2 institutions in the country, along with Gallaudet University in DC, that's focused on deaf education. We have internal data in terms of the ways in which deaf students participate in our regular online classes, and they most certainly gravitate towards them, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes I think for not so good reasons, just hesitancy to participate in alternative communication practice in the classroom. We've not had any conversation at all. I mean, I think, except in a kind of utopian way, wouldn't it be a terrific thing for RIT to do to take kind of international leadership in the MOOC space to be reflecting on these questions? I think we have, I think our instructional designers have done some terrific work in educating edX staff about what the needs of deaf learners might be, and I think that's had some positive impacts. A lot of the things that we've had to work on in terms of captioning and transcripting are kind of second nature to us because we do it in every single class that we deliver in both the face-to-face and online space. This would be, if there's somebody in the Open edX community that would be interested in taking up this question, we could certainly find you conversation partners at RIT.
So I was only going to respond to one thing, but now I'll respond to both. My name's Steve Jacobs. I'm at RIT with Jim. And I wanted to first address the kind of question about TAs and budgets and all that kinds of things. When we did our first X series, one of the models that we put together was that since I was the instructor for the first one in leading the development of the other classes, we used a response model where we hired our undergrad TAs to essentially surf the comments and then highlight to me the stuff that were either really significant comments in terms of quality or topics that were trending, and then I would respond twice a week, like Tuesday, Thursday, and then every Sunday I'd post a summary of what had been going on in the week, since people don't always follow the normal sequence. And that seemed to work well in terms of budget and man hours and things like that. In terms of deafness, I worked my way through school as a sign language interpreter, and I taught at NTID before I taught at RIT. Very quickly, additional things you can do to benefit the hearing impaired communities are additional vocabulary support, right? Textual. If you've got the money and the time, which unfortunately most people don't invest, taking those transcripts and providing a sign language version of those is something that would help, but it's very time and cost intensive. So you have to make sure you want to put that effort in. And I could talk about stuff like that for a really long time, so anyone who's interested, I've got the last session on Thursday, I think, so if you want to meet in the break time before that just to touch base, we can do that.
Do we have any more in the middle? Someone who maybe hasn't asked a question?
Ready?
One in the middle, and then we'll come down front.
So it was just a follow-up to the prior question. Are you guys having any efforts at achieving parity between the micro master's program and the traditional master's program? Are there efforts to attain parity between the two?
We insist that there's absolute parity between them, that the learning that takes place in the micromaster's piece is that part of what we're guaranteeing to our own academic communities and to our accreditors is it's the same work. In terms of, do you mean external perception of parity? Yeah, well, that's the million-dollar question. We're hopeful that employers will begin to pick up on the credential and see its value. We are, certainly my own program, part of the way in which we are trying to act distinctively in the edX community is we've been essentially aggregating anybody's MicroMasters into professional master's degree programs at ours. We have a great partnership with UCSD around data science, but we've signed articulation deals with Harvard, with Berkeley, with the University of British Columbia. So we're trying to figure out how to treat them as a kind of currency and to move them just as easy as we would move any other credit. If anything, I would say we have more articulation, more fluidity in moving MicroMasters graduate credit than we do in moving regular credit.
Hello, thank you. Quick question about just, this seems like a closed loop environment still. We're talking about credential degrees or micro degrees within degrees. To what extent are your systems, being large public institutions focused on educating an entire region, working with either industry to sort of create some sort of articulation where alumni after graduation have a reason to come back for continued education, and or increasing avenues for undergraduates to have more flexible opportunities of professionals that sort of go off from your institutions that might have something to offer into these programmings from a real world experience, can sort of help bridge that question of, do we offer wisdom and practical knowledge to something that's actually kind of answers both?
So it's something that is a big concern of ours, and with some of our specializations that we've developed, we've actually partnered with industry partners. In fact, some of the industry partners have actually funded the development of some of our specializations for that purpose, and usually in a couple of them, what we've done is in the final capstone project, if we try to choose some of the top capstone projects, and then we put those students in touch with the industry partner that has sponsored that micro-credential. I'd really like to be doing more of that, and I think it's of particular importance because in so many of these areas, like big data and data science, the technologies and the products are changing so rapidly that means that these credentials, these specializations have to be, every few years we have to update them, again, to keep up with the changes in the workforce. So it's something that we've done some of, linking more with the industry needs, and I hope to do more of it. It is, again, it's kind of a question of resources to be able to have that be a priority.
So we're at time. I'm told down the front we're at time, unfortunately. Before I say goodbye to this panel, Karen, Jim, and Paul have asked me to remind folks in the room that if you're part of the MicroMasters community of practice, that they're going to meet with you essentially over lunch, and you can sort of gather over in this corner. So if you could please join me in thanking Paul, Jim, and Karen for their time and their insight.